All right, we're off to our first adventure here, and we're talking about exploration and colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Kind of hard to find out and figure out exactly what happens to the land in North America when the British actually take over. And then, of course, throughout the early part of American history up into the early 1800s, there's a lot of land to be traded between the United States, France, and, of course, Spain. So we're going to look at a few ideas that help you understand how land was sort of allotted to those different powers at the early part of our history. We're focusing mostly on the mid-1400s to the mid-1500s. So let's start with a little bit of an overview, and that is we're looking at Europe at that time. And in Europe, the powers of Europe are reliant upon trade from China and India across this thing called the Silk Road. Well, lo and behold, after the Crusades, the Muslim Empire begins to grow, and right across the Silk Road, cutting off trade via the Silk Road. And so the Spanish in the mid-1400s begin to get desperate, and they say, well, let's try this. Let's try going around Africa. Several trips they took them to get around. They finally got around. Oh, but go back. Oh, let's go this way again. And they make it over to China eventually. Well, this is quite a long trip. And the problem is, though, look at the Muslim Empire also occupied the eastern part of Africa. And the result is, there's nowhere to stop. So in the mid-1400s to late 1400s, there were some ideas about some alternatives. And so what happens is, lo and behold, Christopher Columbus comes on the scene in the 1490s, and he says, well, look, you can get to China by going the other way. The world's round. Of course, most people knew it at the time, and most of people, that were scientists and navigators and so on, they were all aware of that. But the average man, probably considering, well, it's flat, it's not really round. But not true. And so Columbus convinces the King and Queen of Spain to allow him to go. They're going to provide for all that he needs in terms of making this expedition in the hopes of getting to China and India by going west. And this is where we begin our story, really, as we get into, well, what does North America look like after these major countries have occupied the territory? So again, pretty obvious, the Spanish were first. Remember, Columbus says, well, I'm in the Indies. I'm off the coast of Indonesia. I'm near India. And, well, he calls them all Indians, but reality, no, he's not. But he doesn't realize that at first. So over time, from 1492, when Columbus, wrong number there, when Columbus actually settles in or establishes settlement in what we call the West Indies today, the Caribbean islands, the Spanish are going to occupy all the territory you see in red. Now, it takes them, obviously, roughly 50 to 70 years before they're actually occupying most of that territory. And, of course, Columbus thought, well, this is the route to get to Asia. But when they figure that all out, what they then begin to rely upon is what they've discovered. And that is, lo and behold, there's gold there. And this is what their focus becomes. And so the Spanish continue to settle and occupy and pull gold out of this part of the New World. And one of the things that happens is, of course, that leads to obvious things, piracy, because there's all kinds of other people who would like to have some of that gold. And so the result is that other countries begin to get the idea, hey, we can do the same thing. So what happens next is that the French are going to make an attempt to get to the New World also. And they're trying to get to Asia by heading west also. If we can find a way around this thing. But lo and behold, they discover that no, you can't. Well, they settle in the areas that are marked out blue here. They start the process somewhere around 1540. It sort of ended around 1590. And the French are going to focus on something very different. When they discover there's no gold and there's no way around this massive land, what they decide to do is, well, they're going to focus on what they know, and that is fashion. Well, the French are all about fashion and food, but at the time, but the thing is that this part of the New World is just filled with little furry creatures, the beaver. And it turns out that that is a very popular substance to make hats and coats, etc. out of back in France. So they begin to work the fur trade, and this is a great relationship with the Indians that they develop, because they're going to rely upon the Indians to actually help them find the beaver, to teach them how to trap the beaver. And that working relationship is going to be very beneficial to the French and to the Indians over time. Now, the last group of people here that are going to be traveling across this great Atlantic Ocean to try and find some place to settle is the English. And they say, well, let's get the leftovers. Look at this. Okay, who wants Hudson Bay, frozen most of the year and filled with polar bears? And then, of course, the leftover little piece of land stuck in amongst the Spanish and the French. And well, what can you use that for? Well, what the British realize is there's no gold in this place. Well, there's no beavers there either. So what do? Well, they're going to focus on business. And this all happens for the English somewhere around, beginning around 1585, but more essentially, better date here is 1607, is when they finally established their first settlement, and we're going to talk more about in the next set of notes actually, but their first settlement in 1607, and they're going to use business as their model, the joint stock company. They're going to use the whole idea that we're going to set up these colonies, they're going to work for us, they're going to pay back their investors. And if things change, if the environment changes, if the natural resources change, we can just change too. We can continue to do business and continue to make money. They're actually going to be the most prosperous of the people that are going to settle in the New World because of that kind of attitude. Now, you're using a worksheet to actually fill this out, and so your worksheet should look very much like this in terms of where the colors are. And please consider creating a key to indicate which country landed in which place. Don't forget that part of the whole process. Now, if you look at number 4, number 4 is really about, the question number 4 in the paper is really about these terms. And the more important things about these terms, and I'm not going to define each of these terms, but when it comes to the Northwest Passage, as countries began to realize that there wasn't a way to get through North America and South America, they tried going around it, and they tried to going north of North America. That's what the Northwest Passage is all about. A way to get to Asia by going north of North America. Now, a colony is what is set up by both the Spanish and the French, as well as by the English. The English did probably a better job of setting up those colonies than the Spanish. It's probably a toss-up between the English and the French. But the idea is that no matter who lives in the New World, they're always connected to where they came from. And so the key idea of a colony is that the mother country, the country that you came from, this is the country that you are connected to. They will dictate your future, and they are in command of most of what you do, and you've got to remember that as a colonist. The joint stock company, basically, again, is the whole idea that there's investors involved in most of the English settling, and so the idea is that these people are going to join together, they're going to buy into this business, and they will control a percentage of it, so somebody might control half, and the person might control 20%, and so on. They create a company, and their business is the business of colonization. They're going to pay for supplies, they're going to pay for the ships and the captains and the crews to get people there, but they expect those people to work for them to pay those bills off. The last term, well, one of the terms that we need to add to our list for number 4 is indentured servants. And as much as we have people that are coming as part of the colonies and the joint stock companies, those people are coming of their own free will and setting up those businesses to work for the joint stock companies. But there are some people that don't really come of their own free will entirely, and that is that they're significantly poor, and they don't have a way to get across the ocean. And so what they need to do is they need to really latch on to someone who can pay their way. So an indentured servant is someone who basically agrees to work for 3 to 7 years, okay, not being paid. You're going to get food, okay, and housing, basically paid for you. And the result is that after 3 to 7 years, you're going to be given your so-called freedom to go your own way. But you do all that in exchange for your trip being paid for across the ocean. And so this is a great way for the people that are really poor to get across to the New World and establish themselves. Now, the last term in number 4 actually gets its own little page here, and that's the Columbian Exchange. Now, this word here, Columbian, almost implies that it has something to do with South America. Please remember, this has something to do with the guy named Columbus. That's the focus here. And that's why it's called the Columbian Exchange. Now, what's unique about the Columbian Exchange is the Columbian Exchange is not something that was thought up by Columbus or the Spanish or anybody else. It was something that naturally occurred because what happens is when people travel from one place to another, they take stuff with them. And so it's important to remember this is a naturally occurring kind of situation. It occurs naturally. It's not something that actually was planned. And so people went from Europe and came to the Americas, and they brought things with them. Well, they left them there. Other people found them and used them. Okay? People traded things for them. And then they found stuff in North America, and they took it back to Europe. And the result was they actually introduced things to Europe. So, I mean, some of the key things, for instance, tomatoes North American, brought back to Europe, and the Italians end up putting them on spaghetti. And by the way, that spaghetti didn't come from Italy either. It came from China. Those are Chinese noodles. Now, at the same time, horses. Horses were from Europe. Indians in North America didn't use horses. They ran around with their spears and with their bows and arrows and with their knives, and they hunted on foot until all of a sudden somebody introduces a horse, and all of a sudden things change for the Indians. But the result is this, that this Columbian Exchange doesn't just involve food or animals. It involves seeds, it involves insects, and it involves illnesses or diseases as well. It's a very important concept that you understand. But it's also something, again, naturally occurs. It's not something that we thought to do or planned to do. Now, the last thing that's in your notes is this thing about the slave trade. And it's because as much as we have people that voluntarily come across the ocean, and as much as we have people that voluntarily sort of sell themselves into a situation of almost like slavery, called indentured servitude, to come across the ocean, we have some people that don't have a choice. They're being brought across the ocean for a very different reason. And so triangular trade was a system of trade between the Americas, West Africa, and the Indies that allowed slaves to be brought into this part of the world. So in your notes on the back of your paper, what I'm asking you to do is to draw this triangle and to label the sides of the triangle, the corners of the triangle, and one of the sides, New England, west coast of Africa, West Indies, and the southern colonies. And so the pattern here of travel is in this direction. It's this pattern, okay? And this pattern of travel starts typically in the springtime in New England. They make their way down to the early summer to the west coast of Africa. They make sure that they are back through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies, really before August, because they want to avoid hurricane season. And then they go back up through the southern colonies to New England to complete the route. This is basically what it would have looked like on a map. And the important thing to remember is that boats don't travel empty. They load things into themselves. So here's the idea is we start off in New England, and we start off in New England with a boat full of rum and goods. Well, be more specific. It was guns, yes. Alcohol and firearms, all right? And they're going to take that rum and guns, and they're going to travel all the way down here to West Africa. And in West Africa, all that is traded for slaves. Now, the important concept here is it's traded. It's not something, slaves are not something that you go running around trying to capture on your own. That's just too much work. The people of Africa, all along the coast of Africa, there are prisons that have been established by the people of Africa, and one tribe is enslaving another tribe and selling them into slavery in exchange for rum and for guns. And of course, they're using the firearms to go off and attack other tribes to get more slaves to do the same thing the following year. And so the slave traders are trading what's in their boat for these people in Africa, and then the slaves are transported back to the Americas across this stretch of the Atlantic known as the Middle Passage. Now, the Middle Passage just is a description of this long, treacherous trip across the ocean. And the reason is that this is basically running parallel to the equator and not that far away from the equator. This is an incredibly hot, a very long, very difficult trip. And on this trip, somewhere between 5 and 10% of all the slaves are going to die on any given boat. Their bodies will be thrown overboard in the ocean. At the end of this trip, they're going to stop in the West Indies. And these little islands off the coast here of South America, at the edge of the Caribbean Sea, these islands are filled with sugar plantations. And so the Spanish continue to operate those sugar plantations, and the result is they need slave labor. And so at these sugar plantations, the slave traders will sell some slaves. They're not going to sell all the slaves. But what they're going to pick up is they're going to trade them for molasses. And so they're going to take that molasses now, and they're going to make sure that they have a ship that is, again, full with people and molasses, and they're going to head now back to New England. But along the way, they're going to make themselves a little detour here, and they're going to stop at multiple ports in the southern part of North America and those southern colonies, and they're going to sell the rest of the slaves. They're going to get rid of all of them at auction. Now, the boat still has molasses on it, and that boat continues then up the coast to New England, and the molasses is going to be traded for the rum and the guns. Turns out that, in fact, molasses is the key ingredient in rum. And so this is a very even swap that happens. And so this is a continual kind of process as these boats travel from year to year around and around. And every time they get back to the southern colonies, here in the southern colonies, this is where the money is made, the cash is made. And it's a very profitable trip. Very, very profitable kind of business. This last picture that you see here is actually of a diagram that was used by captains for these slave trips, these slave trading trips. And you can see here the captains very meticulously tried to figure out how can we pack as many people as possible into these ships, knowing that they're going to lose between 5 and 10% in the process, and they want to make sure that it is as packed as possible and that they get as many across the ocean as possible. In the process of doing this, of course, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of people who are going to die to the conditions in the boat. The result is that even by the time we get to around 1650, slavery is very well established in the English colonies, primarily in the southern colonies, although somewhat in the middle colonies. But that'll be more so the discussion in the next part of our notes. At this point, your worksheet should be done, and you should be looking at the fact that you need to make sure that you understand the major ideas on the worksheet. And those major ideas is who came first and what were they motivated by, and who came second and who came third in terms of settlement of the New World. Okay? We also need to make sure we understand those key terms, but most important of which is the Columbian Exchange. And the third most important thing is the idea of the slave trade and how it operated and why it was profitable and where it was profitable in the process.